Topic number 5 kind of follows in the same vein. Should be topic number 5 says, is science universal or does it have a cultural lens? How can we understand African science if we don't want to understand and institutionalize African spirituality? I look forward to this topic. Let's check out the video.
The periodic table.
All right, peace family. It's none other than your brother, Professor Ace, AfricanCreationEnergy.com. This video is entitled The Influence of Culture on Science. So the purpose of this video is fivefold. 1, to address criticisms. 2, to answer the question, does culture influence and impact science? 3, to answer the question, is it right to racially or ethnically qualify science, or is science universal? Meaning, is it correct or erroneous to use terms like the white man's science, the black man's science, European science, or African science? 4, specify the purpose of making parallels between science to African cultural mythology, philosophy, and theology. And 5, foster and facilitate communication between the Black community, the Black conscious community, and those people in the community pushing and encouraging our people to pursue science. So the first question we want to tackle is, what is the difference between race and ethnicity, right? Ethnicity or ethnic groups are based on culture, geography, and nationality. And I'll provide links in the description to all the resources used in this video. There are 9 major categorizations of cultures or ethnicities globally, which can be further subdivided into even smaller groups. There are over 200 nationalities in the world, and those can even be further subdivided. But the 9 major groups are Western culture or Western civilization, Eastern Orthodox culture or Eastern Orthodox civilization. And when you speak of Western culture or Eastern culture, all of it is European, but the difference between what's qualified as Western culture or Western civilization versus Eastern culture and Eastern civilization when it comes to Europe goes back to the first Christian emperor Constantine, who divided Europe into the Greek East and Latin West. The third type of culture, civilization, or ethnic group is Islamic. The fourth is Sinic or Chinese. The fifth is Japanese. The sixth is Hindu. The seventh is Buddhist. The eighth is Latin American. And the ninth is African. So when it comes to race, race is usually self-identified based on inherited physical characteristics and attributes, and not based on biology, genetics, or anthropology. The definition of race is not consistently applied everywhere, but in the United States, race is based on self-identification with specific nationalities or ethnic groups. The 6 racial groups are white. Those are people identifying with one or more nationalities or ethnic groups originating in Europe, Middle East, or North Africa. Black, those are individuals identifying with one or more nationalities or ethnic groups originating in the Black racial groups of Africa. One issue I've always had is that it involves circular logic. In order to identify as Black, it says you're Black if you identify with one of the Black racial groups in Africa. So it's like, it's circular logic. They don't apply circular logic in the definition in any of the other races, but they do with Black. And all the other racial groups, it always says identifying with the original people of a specific landmass. But when it comes to Black, it says identifying with the Black racial groups of Africa. That circular logic annoys me. Asian is defined as identifying with any of the original people or ethnic groups or nationalities originating in the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. American Indian or Alaska Native is people identifying with any of the nationalities or ethnic groups of North America and South America, including Central America, who maintain tribal affiliation and community attachment. Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander is any people identifying with the nationalities or ethnic groups originating in Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or the Pacific Islands. And multiracial is anybody identifying with a combination of any of the above mentioned races. So let's be clear, right? Race is defined based on self-identification with a specific ethnicity, culture, or nationality, right? And that's the census definition. Again, the resource links are in the description. So now let's answer the first question. Does culture influence and impact science? The answer is yes. Science is not developed in a vacuum or a void free from the influence of culture. In fact, culture drives science, but you don't have to take my word for it. So here is one quote from an article from Berkeley University of California. And again, the link of this resource is in the description. It says, scientists' values and beliefs are influenced by the larger culture in which they live. Such personal views can in turn influence the questions they choose to pursue and how they investigate those questions. Here's another quote from another article entitled Science and Culture from PubMed. And again, the link to this resource is in the description. The quote says, Science and culture are not different entities. Science is part of culture, and how science is done largely depends on the culture in which it is practiced. Lastly, just as science is influenced by culture, culture can also be influenced by science, and cultures that were historically heavily influenced by science tended to develop what's called a scientific culture, which allowed them to become more highly productive scientifically. This blending of science with African culture to create an African scientific culture, which will facilitate making Africans and people of African descent highly productive scientifically, was one of the aims of the African Creation Energy series of books. But again, don't take my word for it. Here is a quote from another article from Sage Journals. The link to this resource is in the description. This article is entitled Scientific Culture and the Construction of a World Leader in Science and Technology. The quote says, "Scientific culture provides a solid foundation and is an important indicator of a world leader in science and technology. Without a world-class scientific culture, it is impossible for a country to become a world leader in science and technology." So does culture influence and impact science? Yes. Next question, is it right to racially or ethnically qualify science, or is science universal, and should it be free from racial and ethnic qualifiers? Meaning, is using terms like white man science, black man science, African science, European science, etc., is that erroneous or is that valid? All right, so the reason why we wanted to start off by defining race and ethnicity is because now that we know that Western civilization is a large ethnic group, then we know that the most frequently used ethnic qualifier when applied to science is the term Western science. The Western in Western science refers to Western civilization or Western culture. And again, those terms, Western and Eastern, as it applies to Europe, that goes back to Christianity and the Pope Constantine. So the first part of that question, is it right to ethnically qualify science? The answer has to be yes. If Western science is a valid term to use, which ethnically qualifies science, and that term is used in a multitude of scholastic papers, then it's right to at least ethnically qualify science. Now, again, recall that race is based on self-identification with a specific ethnicity, right? So if it's right to ethnically qualify science and race is simply self-identification with an ethnicity, then it follows that it must be right to racially qualify science. So terms and phrases like African science or European science, those are ethnic qualifiers to science. Those are valid because Western science is valid. And it follows that since race is self-identification with ethnicity, then terms like white man science and black man science, or white science and black science, can be considered valid also, right? But in terms of answering the question, is it right to racially or ethnically qualify science? Then the answer is yes. Modern science is not yet a universal science, right? Where it has an equal cultural influence by all the people of all the world. That is something aspirational, but does not exist at this point in time. In order to bring about a truly universal science, that means all people from all cultures all over the world would have to contribute their cultural science to the universal body of scientific knowledge. What we can say now is that modern science, which is also synonymous with Western science, that there are people of all races and ethnicities that contribute to modern science, but that doesn't necessarily make it universal science, right? The difference between that and what I'm arguing is like the difference between equal integration versus assimilation, right? Assimilation is basically we set up a culture and then we might get people from all ethnicities and all races all over the world to participate in our culture, but they have to abandon their culture, abandon their ethnicities and assimilate into the dominant culture of the society, right? That's assimilation. However, equal integration would mean that you would have a culture that has equal influence from all the ethnicities and all the races of all the people who are participating within that culture. And that would be universal science, right? So right now, Western science or modern science, we have an assimilation of all ethnicities and all racial groups from all over the world into the existing Western scientific structure, but we don't have an equal integration of the cultural sciences from all those people, from all ethnicities and all races all over the world, right? And this brings us to the purpose of creating parallels between cultural mythologies and philosophies to science, right? So what is the purpose of creating parallels between a cultural mythology, philosophy, and theology to science, right? There are two main reasons, right? So I already did a video talking about why it's valid. Why is it valid to create parallels? And the The simple answer to that is because the precedent has already been established within modern science, right? When you read the origins of modern science or the origin of Western science, they say that they drew parallels between their modern scientific concepts to the mythologies, philosophies, and theology of the ancient Greeks. So that's why it's valid. But what is the purpose? What is the reason for drawing those parallels between African cultural mythologies, philosophies, and theologies to science? Well, there are two reasons, right? One is to show the evolution of the scientific idea. If Western science traces its origins to the Greeks, and the Greeks trace the origins of their science to the ancient Egyptians, then the simple question is, can we identify the concepts in ancient Egyptian mythology, philosophy, or theology, or science, which served as the evolutionary foundation of certain topics in modern science, right? It's basically just drawing a line back. Well, okay, modern science says that their science was influenced by the Greeks. The Greeks said that their science was influenced by the ancient Egyptians. Okay, can we identify any modern scientific concepts that evolved from those concepts of the ancient Egyptians, right? So that's one reason for creating those parallels between modern science to African cultural philosophies, mythologies, and theologies, right? And it's not done to say that the ancient concept is the same thing as the modern concept. That's not why it's done. That's not the reason why either. One is to show how the idea evolved over time, and two is for the enculturalization or to culturalize scientific concepts for a specific culture, right? When we make parallels between modern science using specific cultural mythologies, philosophy, theologies, or specific cultural symbols, it's basically enculturalizes scientific concepts using the symbols, metaphors, and language of a specific culture, right? So hopefully this video helps to bridge the gap for people who come across this video and who use the term white man science, right? Rather than using that term, just start saying Western science instead, right? For people who aspire to promote science to the Black community or the Black conscious community, if someone uses the term white man science, then you just translate in your head, well, what I think, or even ask the person, well, do you mean Western science, right? Instead of using the term white man science, why not use the term Western science? Because that is the ethnic qualifier that is applied to science in scholastic papers, right? And hopefully that will open the dialogue to be more productive and to help get over the barriers that keep us out of STEM. All right, so that's all for now. Peace.
All right, I ain't mad at that video. I get where they're coming from there. Gas has a bunch to say in the chat. Trigger Happy 262. You should respond to Gas. I think that's an interesting conversation that can be had in the chat. Provide triggers. You mentioned you like Gas's commentary, so you should be involved in that as well. Let's get some side convos going in the chat as well. Carl, is science universal, or does it have a cultural lens? How can we understand African science if we don't want to understand and institutionalize African spirituality?
Well, I think it definitely has a cultural lens to it.
Thank you.
No problem. So yeah, I think that's true. It definitely has a cultural lens. And let me say this too, where you can see that in different scientific fields like psychology, for example. There used to be a mental disorders for another thing. There used to be a point where, runaway slaves had a mental disorder. They had drapetomania. That was a classified mental disorder. There was nothing scientific about it, but in the European psyche, these people are running away. Something must be wrong with them. They're not human. So there is an error with that. So I think that's definitely a cultural issue, right, in of itself. That that's how science has a cultural lens to it. I think that we're going to have to reevaluate what that means. And I'm sorry, what was the second question, Coco? Second part of that question?
Sorry. So the second thing is, how can we understand African science if we don't want to understand and institutionalize African spirituality? Like, how come we're not getting back to this African spirituality more?
I would say because we don't see value in it. I think that many of us have been so acculturated, so long within the European society that we don't really see the value in our own things. So I definitely think that's part of the reason behind it. All right, that's just my thoughts on that.
All right, Carl. There's some background noise coming through, Carl, when you're talking, so just be mindful of that. Buana, what say you?
Yeah, so I might be out of my league with this kind of discussion, but where I'll start is I understand Trigger Happy's gripe in terms of not displacing African spirituality. I think African spirituality has a place, but you will never see a whole blanket of, because people are different. You know what I mean? The people who are invested in African spirituality should invest in African spirituality. The people who feel as if or believe that it's not um, contributed contributive to their existence, then they just leave it alone. You know what I mean? You ain't gonna never have a complete, you know, situation where everybody disagreed that African spirituality has a place. Even in a completely African society, you're gonna always have the outliers who's gonna say, well, that really has no form and fashion in my life, and they're gonna operate as such. But I understand his perspective in pushing this idea of African spirituality because it needs to be pushed, in particular in the Western world among us. You know, that idea needs to exist. You know, I think it does have a space, and I am an agnostic person saying this. Keep that in mind. In terms of sciences, there is, I believe, that there should be parallels that exist. You know, in terms of, because there's a such thing as scientific racism that has a long tradition in the Western world, and these things should be considered in terms of this whole universal approach of Western science and Western medicine and all these other kinds of terms. I think that when one of Gas' arguments is that, you know, diasporic Africans love to standardize um, science in terms of the Western, because we live in the Western world. And I get his point, because, you know, when you, in terms of looking at Africa and having this universalist perspective of standardizing African science and African medicine, an Asoko man would heal a broken wound would probably be completely different than how a Zulu in South Africa would heal a broken wound. So I understand that. I really do. So you can't just stamp African medicine on top of that and say, well, this is African medicine, because how one group of Africans would look at a particular uh, objective or perspective, scientific problem, would be completely different than how another group of Africans was. So to standardize it, there will be a whole lot of difficulty involved. But I believe the problem when in his assertion is when he says or suggests that, well, he only said that diasporic Africans take this approach. But what I would say to that is how a Jamaican would deal with a cold, you know, because we ain't talking about westernized. How just a Jamaican would deal with a cold. He would use Monash water. That's what they say. If you have a flu or cold, get some Monash water. How a Bahamian would deal with a cold, he say, get some Suracey. Yeah, get some Suracey. You know, if we had the mumps, they say, well, bathe that Bejerine over there, or shepherd needle. A Jamaican will say something completely different. So we don't necessarily we don't have when you look at us in the Western world, we don't really standardize unless you completely have a westernized mind. You say, well, take a pill for it. Go to the doctor and take a pill for it. How we deal with our scientific and medical issues is, you would find that is variances that exist among us as well. But I think that there is a difficulty in this whole idea of standardization, and I believe that creating parallels, but it just becomes a hodgepodge of things, because, you know, what one doctor say in the Western world will be completely what one doctor say in the Eastern world will be completely different when you go to the hundreds of nations that exist in Africa, or what all of them are saying. So I think that standardization has its place in a situation like that. So, but in dealing with that, I would say, if you look at a scientific or a medical issue, what is what is the best solution for the problem that exists? What has the best outcomes? And when you're dealing with that, my approach would deal in bulk. Because if 50,000 people had a particular problem, let's say flu, and I was able to cure 50,000 people, but over here I was able to cure 1,000,000 people with my solution to the problem or my approach to the problem. I think that in looking at that particular situation, because the outcome is greater, I would accept accept the African solution from the outcome where is 1,000,000 people as opposed to 50,000 people. So that would be my approach in trying to even solve that kind of issue, in terms of trying to come up with some version of standardization. But I do agree that there should be parallels that exist, because what one man say in the Western world, what I mean, it might be good, but the Eastern world might have a completely different approach, as well as the African man, as well as the other men that exist on this planet. So I think that all these things have its place. It's just that we ain't work out the kinks of these kinds of different issues that currently exist. But I wouldn't just put a stamp on it and say, well, this is the African way. What's that? Which part of Africa? Who African person are you talking about? I think that these kinks have not been worked out as yet. These approaches in terms of stamping the term African medicine on it has not been worked out yet among us. That's not really been approached. As a matter of fact, we still in the white man hospital. Yeah, we still looking at white man solutions for these kinds of scientific or medical problems that currently exist. So I think that the first step is to break away from that first, and then get to a point to where we could standardize in going forward in our terms and our traditions and our ways in solving our own issues. You know what I mean? Commodifying it, quantifying it, writing it on paper, and then take that approach going forward. But that's the way I would deal with that particular issue. It's had so many different nuances when you reference these kinds of questions, man. But I enjoyed the video, and I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm also going to post this video on the Discord so you guys can check it out. I will say something. I'll add something here before any last thoughts. Unfortunately, I think the way we go about our re-Africanization, we go about it in a European way. So I think we tend to think, okay, well, if we're going to implement an African spirituality or African science, that it has to be this all-encompassing, all-continental ideology that, of course, could clash with the spiritual and scientific of different regions, etc. I think we just need to understand that we need to, right? When we say Africa or African, just understand that we need to define our own realities. And if the Isoko man sees water as, instead of having 2 hydrogens, it has 4, then that's the Isoko man. Then that's what he does. He operates around that belief, right? If the Zulu decide that H2O doesn't even make sense and water is symbolized better by something totally different, that's cool for them. Just make it work. Build off of whatever that is, build upon it, and make it work. And if it doesn't work, you're gonna have to seek something else. But make it work. If the Isoko man has a African science that involves his spirituality, if it has results, then keep at it. If it's giving you results, then keep at it. We don't have to have this one definition of what African science or African spirituality is. Again, that's how the Europeans standardize their bullshit. That's how they standardize their bullshit. We don't have to do that. We can have different strains or varieties of quote unquote science or spirituality. Do you guys have any other words you want to add here?
No, ultimately, I think that it all falls down with who controls the world, who has the power to implement their view and their way. In the Western world, they say might makes right. So I think that ultimately it'll fall to that. However, you will always have some variances in terms of power. You know, so the Chinese has been able to keep their way and fashion of the Eastern medicine because they have the power to. They have the collective power to. And I think that until we get the collective power to as well, this will always be the question that's put out there. You know what I mean? But that's just me.
Gas in the chat says, Koku, think of this. They often chide us and say they never invented the wheel. Have any of them ever tried to run a wheel on non-paved soil or mud? LOL. Yeah. You know, I think we got to get off this. I think even our re-Africanization is Europeanized, unfortunately, and I don't know how to deal with it. It's something I ponder all the time. I don't know exactly how to deal with it because we think we have to match what they do with an African view of it. It's quite a quandary we're in. It's quite a quandary we're in. No last words on this topic. All right, let me post what Shoot the Breeze topic number 6 is going to be. We're doing excellent time tonight. We'll be done at 2 a.m. for sure. Shoot the Breeze topic number 6 is going to be the Great Nigerian Exodus, aka Japa Ing, which I've never heard of before. Trigger Happy heard about it. By the way, Trigger Happy, thanks for those 2 great topics just now. Hopefully you'll post more, similar topics like it. We can have further discussions on that too. And Gas, if you ever decide to come back on the net, man, let's me and you do a discussion on this very topic and the Newtonian and Kant's and those concepts and stuff. Let's talk about that in terms of African worldview. I think that's a good discussion to have. With that said, Should Be topic number 6 is going to be the Great Nigerian Exodus, aka Japa Ing. Let's do a station ID break, and on the other side, we'll discuss Shoot the Breeze topic number 6.